Welcome to Book Rising, a podcast by the Radical Books Collective.
Thanks everyone for tuning back into Book Rising. I'm Meg Arenberg, host of the Radical Publishing Futures series, and today I'm here with Ra Page, CEO and founder of Comma Press, a nonprofit publishing house based in Manchester. Comma specializes in the short story in the form of both single author collections and multiple author anthologies, publishing work by both UK-based and international writers, often in translation. Comma also does a great deal to support aspiring writers, translators, and publishers to enter the industry, offering courses, conferences, seminars, and mentorship schemes and other supports for overcoming the barriers that arise from persistent biases in publishing. Among these are the National Creative Writing Industry Day and the Manchester in Translation Conference, which Comma hosts every year. Ra Page himself has edited over 20 anthologies, and prior to founding Comma Press, also worked as a journalist and filmmaker. He has also founded and coordinated a number of publisher development initiatives, including the Northern Fiction Alliance, which is a radical collective of small independent presses based in the north of England. Welcome to Book Rising, Ra.
Thank you, Megan. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thanks so much for taking the time to be with us. So as I said, you were a journalist and a filmmaker before you became an editor and publisher. I wonder if you could start by just telling us how you came to publishing and how you ended up founding Comma Press.
Yeah, I was working as a journalist, as a freelancer, and also sometimes as a staffer, both regionally for regional presses, regional magazines, and for national newspapers. And I was doing cultural journalism, so I was interviewing and reviewing lots of writers. And I just learned through talking to writers that at that time, this was around the turn of the century, 2000 or just before, at that time, there was really no platform for the publishing of short stories. Lots of writers, lots of novelists were still writing short stories, but they had nowhere really to place them, to see them published, or very, very few places. And some of them even kind of self-published them, whilst also publishing their novels with major publishing houses. So I just approached the magazine that I was with, and I talked to some publishers that I'd developed relationships with, including an editor called Simon Prosser at Penguin, and together we kind of explored this idea of regional short fiction set outside of London, outside of the home counties, set in cities in the north in particular. Media and culture in the UK is very, very, very centralized around London and what are called the home counties. So there were two problems really. There were two kind of gaps in the market. One was just the lack of short fiction being published in book form, and also the lack of writing that was set in and about what perhaps kind of patronizingly referred to as the provinces. There's a huge amount of creativity in the north, but at the time, the only narratives about the north or the northern cities were kind of exoticized, and their northernness, their grittiness, and all the cliches associated with that were kind of pushed to the forefront in the way that they were marketed, and the kinds of books that were being published. So we wanted to create a space for different types of writing about those northern cities and set in those cities, and a space for short fiction. So I worked with a number of magazines, starting off in Manchester, kind of listings magazines, arts magazines, to distribute them free with those magazines as a kind of like a free pull-out supplement. So we did it in 4 cities across the north: Manchester, Liverpool, Leeds, and Newcastle. And then it kind of slowly grew into a book project and a publishing house. Also at the time, kind of regional journalism, print journalism was sort of dying in the north. There was a lot of free sheets and free newspapers flooding the market, national free sheets, and the old model of newspapers being funded primarily through people buying them was long gone. And so, yeah, regional journalism was dying, and I had to make a decision: either move to London and carry on as a journalist, or do something else. And all my friends, and kind of, yeah, social life was very much still here. So I decided to do something else, which was, as I say, slowly set up comma. And as you mentioned, you can't be interested in the short story as a form without being interested in it as a kind of international kind of form. So very early on, we started commissioning translations, and we started publishing work from all over the world, but from many different languages. Started with Europe, but then moving further afield. The short story is a very international form. It jumps around in terms of its influence. It's very translatable in terms of it sort of gathers up its context. The short story much more than a novel can gather up its context and can be transplanted into another cultural context much more easily, I feel. So we're always very keen to kind of hit the ground running with translation work as well.
Yeah, I've heard you say in other interviews that publishing the short story is an attempt to democratize literature. I think I was interested in that framing and what it is about the short story that makes it uniquely able to do that. So you're saying it's sort of translatability, but is there anything else about the short story in particular as a genre?
Absolutely. There's lots of ways in which it's democratizing. Just simply in terms of the logistics of translating, for instance, if you want to do if you want to look at the latest Egyptian author, you could go, or Egyptian writing at the moment, you could go for one Egyptian author and publish a book, or you can publish an anthology of 10 different stories, which will all contradict each other stylistically, if it's a good anthology, and it'll often different points of view. So the anthology in itself is a far more democratic form than the novel, obviously for sort of obvious kind of logistical reasons. But there's also something in the short story which lends itself to kind of underdog or peripheral points of view. The quote that I'm always quoting is a line from the Irish writer and critic Frank O'Connor in his book The Lonely Voice, where he talks about the short story. He says the short story is different to the novel because it doesn't have heroes in the traditional sense of the novel. By that he meant characters who are important within their own fictional space. So people that other people look up to, people that are successful or find success, people that eventually win power and influence and things like this, and are critical players in that fictional universe. The short story, according to Frank O'Connor, doesn't foreground those kinds of characters. It foregrounds what he calls submerged population groups, by which he meant underdogs, people on the peripheries, people without stake in society, people who are disenfranchised, etc., etc. So, if, for instance, you want to publish kind of the voices of refugees or the voices of people, grassroots activism, if you want to focus on topics like that, the short story is much more capable of doing that, because it's automatically saying I'm not really interested in the great leaders of the past or historical figures or successful figures. We all know you can do that version of those stories. You can talk about Steve Jobs being a successful migrant or whatever, but you can also just talk about ordinary people, and the short story gives you that permission to talk about ordinary people whose importance or position or status in their world isn't something that's required for our attention.
So interesting. I'm also curious, just on the side, the sort of more practical side of the work of publishing and how you go about finding your titles. If there's anything sort of specific about finding short story writers, if there's some part of that process that's different than it would be if you were publishing novels or nonfiction, for instance. I mean, you mentioned that you have a number of authors who are publishing, or that part of what made you interested in short stories was that you had authors publishing in prominent presses elsewhere their long fiction, but having to self-publish their shorter stories. So anything about how you go about finding your titles?
Yeah, I think most editors will give you the same answer, and it's really, really unhelpful, but it's a really easy answer, which is they're looking for something they've not seen before. I mean, that's
Yeah.
really, really difficult. It's defining it in the negative, and it's not very helpful thing to hear if you're a writer. But they just, we're all looking for something different. The way the market works is the opposite in terms of marketing a book. It markets you in terms of what you're similar to and what you're like, and it finds out where you are in the constellation of influences and styles, and says you're a little bit left of this writer and a little bit, down a bit or south of this writer. But what we're really interested in terms of editorially, we're just interested in something that is fresh and surprising and shocking and new. And it's that whole kind of make it new kind of imperative. Sometimes that will be a stylistic thing, and if you're lucky enough to have a writer who is producing something which stylistically is nothing like anything you've read before, then you're very, very lucky. And the short story allows you to kind of push that envelope a lot as well, because the short story contains its structure in the, and can play with its structure and create literary conceits out of its structure that just can't be sustained for a novel. You can tell a short story backwards, or you can tell a short story in which time is moving at a great pace. So geological time is speeding past, a stick speeding past. You can tell a short story where there's, where everybody's mad, or the main characters are a cockroach or a beetle. You can do lots and lots of interesting things with a short story, but they just wouldn't kind of keep the reader going necessarily. The intrigue wouldn't keep the reader going for a novel. So there's a lot more expectation when it comes to stylistic ingenuity and plasticity and innovation. But it's also one of the main things I'm always surprised by is just how many different voices and points of view are simply not in there when it comes to the canon, the kind of mainstream publishing, or what's being published elsewhere. So, recently we published a short story by a Uyghur writer, and in a book called Walls Collapse, and another story by, or sort of story stroke essay by a Rohingya writer in a Cox's Bazar, in a refugee camp at Cox's Bazar. These are points of view that we all know about Uyghurs and Rohingyas, kind of their general plight and condition, but we aren't hearing from them. So often when it comes to learning about the rest of the world, we traditionally send our people out there, in a kind of literary version of the old grand tour. When it comes to journalism and media, we send familiar faces, our reporters, our trusted man in the field. We send, or woman in the field, we send out into the unknown, and they present these foreign lands as even more foreign, because it has to be packaged in a kind of domestic way, or a British way in our case, and we don't hear those points of views from, or kind of experience those perspectives from the people we're talking about. So the indigenous people or whatever. So there's the actual space. When I say I'm looking for something new, that space of for what is new is huge. It's completely untapped. There's so much that's repeated and recycled in terms of our narrow culture. There's an infinite space of untapped kind of novelty and newness out there. It's actually much easier than you think. You just have to look in different places.
Yeah. Well, I know Kama also hosts a couple of different prizes, a short story prize and an emerging translators prize. And I was curious if that's one primary way, or in terms of translations, if you're often taking pitches from translators themselves.
Yeah, we're approached all the time by translators, and we're continually looking for new translators and young translators, and trying to widen the pool of translators that we work with, both in terms of the different languages that they're translating from, and also the kind of the demographic and of those translators themselves. So I'm occasionally kind of approached by a translator who has really in-depth knowledge of a particular country or culture, and they propose to me anthologies and projects. So, and that's fantastic when it happens. Like, we did a book of short stories from Khartoum, capital of Sudan, and that ended up being, I think it was the first properly produced and distributed anthology of short fiction translated from the Arabic from Sudan ever. I think there was a pamphlet that came out in the 80s in connection with the US Embassy, but this is the first kind of proper anthology that's ever been translated from the Arabic. So so that came about through two translators approaching me and giving me like an amazing introduction to Sudanese writing and proposing all different stories and writers and just a conversation between them, and it's an amazing experience. So we're always looking for new translators. We're also trying to broaden the non-European kind of work that's being translated in the UK. In the UK, we're famously a little bit reluctant when it comes to reading work in translation. Many years ago, the much bandied around figure was that British bookshops only have 3% of their work in translation. Whilst if you go into a French bookshop or a German bookshop, it's more like 60, 70, 80%. I think we've got a little bit better since then, but it's still very, very small. So we don't read much in translation. And that which we do is often European writers and European languages. So there's a huge amount of work to be done there. So this year we're publishing a Hindi writer, Dalit Hindi writer, and we're publishing Kurdish science fiction. So yeah, there's lots of other languages out there and lots of opportunities really for breaking new ground and for giving a platform to writers that are not represented and languages that are not represented.
Yeah, I mean, I think we can probably give you a run for the money in the US in terms of publishing translations as well. I mean, it's that sort of persistent monolingualism and yeah, I mean, provincialism really, I think, is a problem in our industry as well. Could you give us a sense of what, I mean, do you have a sense of who Comma Press's readers are? How would you characterize your readership?
It's a variety of different, but sometimes overlapping segments. It's really tricky because the short story allows you to do so many different things, and that's the fun of it. So we have a horror genre kind of project or series. We have a historical fiction series. We have a science fiction series, lots and lots of literary fiction, lots of kind of international translation work, obviously, and they all have different audience groups. And we just recently re-released a classic text from 1949 by a British science fiction writer and horror writer called Nigel Neal. This book that was out of print for many years, and that audience is a very avid, loyal, passionate audience, and you might not think it has crossover with other parts of what we do, but there is lots of crossover. A couple of years ago, we started a series of commissioning science fiction from countries and cultures that are maybe not associated with science fiction, particularly. So that started with Iraq, a book called Iraq Plus 100, and Palestine, and Kurdistan and Egypt are next. And when we brought those out, they were incredibly popular from all different types of audiences. So science fiction audience readers that had never thought about, the idea of Palestinian science fiction or Iraqi science fiction. Also, people who are interested in those regions and those writers from those areas generally loved it. And so it was like a Venn diagram of lots of people with kind of passionate interest in those particular or those 2 or 3 different kind of interest areas. So there isn't a specific audience that we're going for. Obviously, our kind of radical history projects are kind of inevitably going to be going to appeal to readers on the left, readers that are sort of socially and politically engaged. But then there's also, we have a kind of science interfiction series and a psychotherapy / horror series, which again are very, very different. But at the core of it all is the love of the short stories. So that is really the alpha and the omega of what we do. It's the short story doing something different and pulling off a trick that other forms just couldn't dream of doing.
Yeah. Have things changed for Comma at all in this age of digital publishing? I mean, I think you were founded in the early 2000s, is that right?
Yeah, we started in the early 2000s, 2003, and we sort of founded officially in 2007, incorporated rather. Yeah, well, the digital revolution was slightly exaggerated. There was a point, I think, in 2012, 2013, where people were saying if the next Dan Brown book doesn't do well in hard copy, then the publishing industry is going to implode, hard copy publishing industry, and we're all just going to be reading ebooks, and there'll be the book will die. So there was a lot of kind of hype and exaggeration around that, and ebooks have plateaued and dropped to, depending on what sector you're working in, 20% of the market, something like this. So the revolution that was heralded didn't quite happen. Obviously, it's still a major part of the industry, but the physical book, paper book is still king, and people still love it and cherish it. I think the bigger differences are really the biggest changes have been over the last couple of years with the pandemic and the way in which people are engaging with literature and art generally, but especially literature and thought. It's gone massively online. It's moved over to things like this podcast and video events on Zoom, online events. That's really kind of changed the way that we work as a publishing company, and also the way communities are built. So we also run short story creative writing workshops and courses and lots of other sort of writer development events, and they are generally much stronger even now online than they were before. And I think festivals have been suffering a lot, and may have to. The number of festivals in the UK was huge, and I think some of them might drop away in the next few years, just because people are just still a little bit hesitant to go back to those kind of live events, and obviously the economic problems that Britain is facing at the moment is hugely impactful.
Yeah. I know you've talked some about how centralized this publishing industry has become, increasingly so, with fewer and fewer players, both in publishing and in book selling. And I'm thinking partly about, the work that you're doing with the Northern Fiction Alliance in, creating collectivities for smaller players. And I just wonder, I mean, these could easily be your competitors, but if you could say something about what becomes possible when you collaborate in that way.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, technically they are all our competitors, really, because they're competing for eyeballs and reading time and things like that. So, but yeah, there is something very, very worrying about the increasing centralization of what's now the big four. A few years ago, like 20 years ago, it was the big 12. There's now 4, and it may shrink down to 2. Ultimately, when you're working in a corporate kind of matrix, like one of the big 4, I'm not going to name anybody specifically. Your department, your imprint, your writers, your individual titles are all judged on their balance sheets. So it becomes a risk-averse kind of industry, and it becomes an industry that works through copycats, can buy it through copycat books and formulas and trends, and it becomes a very kind of not incestuous, but it's a very kind of insider network of decision makers and gatekeepers, and the European market and the North American market and the European language market is very, very well connected. Everybody goes to the same 2 or 3 book fairs every year. Everybody meets everybody. Every year, everybody knows everybody because it's not that large an industry, and they kind of know each other's tastes and they swap books backwards and forwards, and you get a lot of predictability within that. And I think it's interesting sometimes to remind ourselves that if you're working for HarperCollins, you are owned by Rupert Murdoch. So if you're working for Penguin Random House, or one of their many imprints, you're working for Bertelsmann's, a massive Central European German media company. If you're working for Hachette, you're working for a retail conglomerate called Le Jardin, which their main activity is sportswear, or that's their kind of their starting point was a sportswear retail empire. So these aren't little cottage industries. They're not industries that are driven by passion or founder vision or anything like that. They're just industries that are run by their own balance sheets and their profit margins, etc., etc. So it's edifying to know who's paying for this, who's bankrolling this, who owns it ultimately. Even if you can't really draw a line between him and all the decision-making processes, you can't really create a causal link. But it's good to know that. And yeah, the things like the Northern Fiction Alliance are just a small attempt, one of many around the world, where we're trying to just bring people's awareness up a little bit about the structures of publishing. A lot of people walk into a bookshop, and when they walk into a bookshop, they think they're immediately doing something radical, bohemian, left field, intellectual, independent, all these adjectives that we like. They immediately think by default, by buying a book, they're doing that. And obviously, it depends on the book, and in many cases, they are, no matter who's published it. But they should also maybe know that this is a marketplace that's driven by capital, just like any other marketplace, and it's a marketplace that drives out other points of view ferociously, and other perspectives and things that, quotes, don't work ferociously. And when you're just talking about independence is a way of sort of broadening the horizon of what a book buyer might be thinking about.
So for you, I mean, given this context, given the centralization that you're describing, given this, I mean, you're all players in a capitalist system. In your view, what would have to change for independent, radical, non-corporate publishing to really thrive?
It's a really, really difficult question. I think there needs to be a breaking down of the way that publishing works at the moment. As I say, everybody decamps to London Book Fair and Frankfurt Book Fair and these major book fairs, and everybody talks about the same books and follows the same style formula, and they're all using kind of similar supply chains in terms of the processes of marketing books. And so for some of that to change, you need to have publishers that set boundaries around how they're going to work and how they're going to work differently, and really sort of kind of follow through on those commitments. like there's a great awareness around lack of diversity in the publishing industry at the moment. There has been for many years. There's countless reports every year. There's a couple of new reports about how white and privileged and middle class and London-centric publishing industry is. And there's lots of initiatives, recruitment initiatives and HR initiatives and things like that are delivered or brought into play, but it never changes. And you have to sort of, I don't know, you have to look at those people that are not subject to the same pressures. So a small publishing house based in the north of England, or based a long way away from the metropolis, has more freedom to break some of the pressures that result in publishing being white, middle class, privileged, etc., etc. So I think there's not going to be a magic kind of silver bullet, magic bullet rather, to fix any of these things. But I think it will be a small incremental process of publishers saying, we're not going to do this anymore. Like, we're only going to do this, and sticking to those commitments. A few years ago, a publishing house said, and other stories in the UK said, we're only going to publish women in 2018. We said we're only going to translate from the Muslim banned countries in I think it was 2017. So those kind of, they may feel like gestures, but if people stick to them and kind of follow them through, it will make, I think, some change. I also think that it may be a question of changing copyright law in some way, or changing some of the sort of structural kind of parameters around publishing. I know it's not a popular suggestion, and it sounds like it would be very, very detrimental to authors, but when the copyright law is about protecting existing kind of monoliths, and copyright law in Britain was introduced to stop Scottish publishers from producing, quotes, knockoff Shakespeare plays, and it was about restricting the rights for doing that to London publishers. So it's about retaining power. So maybe we need to have a kind of a radical rethink, or some countries need to have a radical rethink about that, and the way in which copyright does retain that power. It keeps power where power already is. If you look at the film industry in France, they have an amazingly healthy, and they always have done, a film industry, and that's simply because cinemas have a quotient to meet. I think it's 30%. 30%. Oh, don't quote me on this. It might be slightly different, but I think it's 30% of the films they show have to be French language films. That immediately creates an industry, a very, very rich and prolific and enviable industry. If you look at the British industry, it's almost as if there's some law which says, we can only make films about quaint Englishness as seen through the eyes of American audiences, and they have to have a royal involved at some point, or a famous, or Churchill, or these established great figures. If you actually set limits on the market, if you impose requirements on the market in a top-down way, you can actually help difference to thrive, which is a slightly unpopular point of view.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, tell us what's up and coming at Comma Press. What should we be on the lookout for in terms of, what's going to blow our minds and be something we've never seen?
Thanks. No pressure.
Yeah, no, right.
So we've got as I say, we've got a series of books of science fiction from different parts of the world. So we've got Kurdish and Egyptian science fiction coming out later in this year, in the new year, which is it's trying to fold the past into the future. So it's using the future and a future date to re-look at and re-examine examine something that's happened in the past in those countries. So the Egyptian one is particularly interesting because it's looking at the 2011 revolution in Tahrir Square and the 2013 coup, which kind of destroyed that revolution, and key events in that 2-year period, including things like the massacre of Rabaa Square, which are not known about, and if are not talked about, and if people did talk about them, we would all be horrified. So it's about using a different context to talk about through analogy or allegory rather, and metaphor, talking about to explore those historical moments. The Palestine Plus 100 book that I mentioned looked at the Nakba of 1948 and all the stories were set 100 years after that. And these books work in a similar way. We also have an anthology which will be followed by a whole series of superhero activist stories. So there's a book called the first book in the series is called The Cuckoo Cage. There's a tradition in British protest history, or kind of a folk tradition of certain political movements, grassroots movements, especially sort of pre-industrial movements, banding together under a specific pseudonym or a mythic character. So the Luddites, for instance, was an ongoing movement in the late 18th century, early 19th century against automation and the replacement of jobs with machines. And it conducted its business under this figurehead, who was often a large man for some reason that's not fully understood, dressed in a petticoat and a woman's bonnet. And there's a series of riots in Wales, in South Wales, in the late 1830s, early 1840s, called the Rebecca riots, where local men would dress up and in the middle of the night go out and smash up toll booths, but also enact a certain kind of to and fro, like a scripted performance. And there's lots of examples of these, and they're a little bit performative. They're kind of like a cross between cosplay, amdram, amateur dramatic theatre, and protest, and kind of rough music or chevalier, which is or skimmington, which is a kind of folk tradition in rural communities, dressing up a figure and kind of parading with that figure. It's a very strange tradition, and it's not really talked about or much known anymore. But it seems to have the dress up component of it seems to have some connection with or had some kind of similarities to the cosplay culture around superheroes. This adoption of these other identities, and often the character has kind of supernatural powers of some kind. So what I did was I asked a bunch of writers to kind of relocate, transplant those characters, those figures into contemporary Britain during the lockdown as well, and write and set them in motion against similar sort of political struggles in the present or in near future Britain. So, and give them superpowers as well. So it's kind of trying to radicalize the superhero. The superhero is like obviously a ubiquitous form at the moment in terms of cinema and our TV, but it's also a really, really conservative form. If you look at the kind of the archetypes of the superhero canon, they're all about either protecting justice, truth, justice in the American way, and they're kind of a police, like a policeman, but with superpowers. Or they're worse, they're sort of vigilantes who don't believe in the power of the state to solve problems, like Batman. So they're kind of conservative, perhaps even right-wing entities in terms of their role within society. They don't challenge social injustice. They challenge injustice according to very, very narrow sort of definitions, like petty criminality, theft, and things like that, and obvious kind of criminality. So this project explores the idea of resistance movements and how that can interface with superhero kind of culture. And it's something that we've delivered the first book, and I'm commissioning a second book, and I'm also looking at an international kind of edition of that book, looking at stateless peoples in particular. So I've commissioned writers from Western Sahara, Tamil writer, Palestinian, Kurdish, etc. Writers from peoples, demographics that don't have kind of state representation, a country of their own to speak of, because it goes back to this idea of the disenfranchisement of the short story character and how much stake they have in society and how society protects them or represents them. In the case of many of these people, not at all. So yeah, it's an experiment in superhero activism.
Great. Will you go over those three titles one more time? The first you mentioned, the Egyptian.
It's Egypt plus 100.
Egypt plus 100.
Kurdistan plus 100. And the Cuckoo Cage.
The Cuckoo Cage. Fantastic. Well, thank you so much. This has been a great conversation. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.